Pam Bondi had reigned for 8 years as the unassailable legal sovereign of Florida. Cultivating a formidable political career and a network of high-powered connections while consumer complaints against predatory corporations piled up in her office's filing cabinets until the day JD Vance asked her one simple question about a specific $25,000 donation and her entire empire started crumbling on live television. She arrived at the national news studio in Georgetown with her usual high-status entourage, 3 specialized legal staffers, 2 private security guards, and presumably someone whose sole professional responsibility was to ensure her hair maintained at platinum camera-ready perfection that costs more than most working Americans earn in a month. She was there for what she anticipated would be a friendly, respectful conversation about leadership in challenging times, a soft-focus legacy rehabilitation tour where she could remind the national audience that she was the first female Attorney General of Florida. Historic, groundbreaking, revolutionary, these were the labels she had carefully curated for herself. She had agreed to this appearance thinking it would be a safe harbor. No aggressive ambushes, no adversarial journalism, just thoughtful inquiries about her tough on crime achievements that she could answer with expertly rehearsed talking points while nodding wisely at the camera. The network had billed it as a bipartisan dialogue on the ethics of state prosecution. Bipartisan, how quaint, how civilized, how utterly deceptive. What Pam Bondi did not know was that JD Vance, Yale law graduate, best-selling author, senator, and someone who actually treated financial disclosure forms and campaign contribution filings as recreational reading, had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this specific moment with the surgical intensity of a federal prosecutor building a RICO case. Vance sat across from her, looking almost criminally young at 40, wearing a simple, unremarkable navy suit that likely cost less than one of Bondi's designer scarves. In front of him lay a leather portfolio that was stuffed so full of documents, affidavits, and bank records that it looked visibly pregnant with evidence. He offered a smile when she walked in, that quintessential Midwestern nice guy smile that makes you think he is about to offer you a glass of sweet tea right up until the moment you realize he is actually offering you a final chance to confess before he utterly buries you under a mountain of facts. The moderator, an earnest broadcast anchor who probably believed this would be a dignified discussion of judicial philosophy and administrative procedure, opened the segment with softballs about restoring public faith in government institutions. Bondi immediately launched into her standard, well-worn spiel about protecting Florida families and standing up for the rule of law. She said this from behind designer glasses that cost more than a month of groceries for an actual working family in the Florida Panhandle. She smoothly name-dropped her prestigious legal background and her roots in Tampa, conveniently forgetting to mention the intricate web of lobbying interests that had financed her ascent. Then, Vance leaned forward, deliberately opened that heavy leather portfolio, and asked in that calm, almost gentle Ohio accent that somehow made every word feel 1,000 times more devastating. "Madam General," he began, "before we discuss the abstract concept of restoring faith in institutions, I am genuinely curious about a specific sequence of events from your tenure. You served as the highest legal officer of Florida for 2 terms. Your official salary peaked at approximately $128,000 per year. Yet, your political influence and the funding behind your initiatives reached into the tens of millions. Specifically, I want to look at the fall of 2013. The studio went dead silent. You could actually hear one of the veteran cameramen inhale sharply. The moderator's eyes went wide. This was definitively not in the pre-approved script. Bondi's smile didn't just fade. It froze on her face like Botox in a deep winter frost. JD Vance just sat there with that portfolio splayed open, smiling that polite, terrifying smile, waiting for her to justify the record. "Madam General," Vance continued, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "In September 2013, your office was being flooded with thousands of complaints from Florida citizens, retirees, veterans, and struggling students, who claimed they had been systematically defrauded of their life savings by a private, university, entity. Your staff had already prepared a draft to join a multi-state fraud investigation. But then, something miraculous happened, or perhaps, something transactional. Within days of your office receiving a $25,000 campaign contribution from the very foundation controlled by the individual owning that university. The investigation was abruptly dropped. You claimed your office found no basis to proceed. Vance leaned in closer, the studio lights reflecting off the sheer volume of paper in his folder. I had to ask, Madam General, what is the secret to such impeccable timing? Should the citizens of Florida believe that a $25,000 check is the standard market rate to blind the Attorney General's office to a fraud case? Or was that just a special, introductory offer for your prestigious donors? What happened in the next 90 minutes didn't just go viral. It became the exact moment an entire generation of Americans realized that the law and order slogans were often just a thin veneer for a pay-to-play aristocracy. The historic first female Attorney General card couldn't save her from this. Not even her high-level endorsements or her frequent appearances as a legal expert on cable news could freeze this avalanche. If you think I am exaggerating, you haven't seen the receipts yet. And trust me, Vance had brought every single one of them, every bank statement, every internal email from her own frustrated investigators, and every deposit slip. Bondi recovered her composure with the jagged, desperate skill of someone who had been deflecting uncomfortable questions for decades. Decisions in my office were always made based on the legal merits of the case. She started, her voice tight. That contribution was handled by my political team and had absolutely no bearing on the professional judgment of my assistant attorneys general. Let us talk about those legal merits. Vance interrupted smoothly, pulling out the first set of internal memos from the portfolio. These are emails from your own senior investigators dated October 2013. They describe the evidence against the university as overwhelming and documented. Yet, 48 hours after the check for $25,000 cleared your account, you personally issued a statement saying there was no basis for Florida to join the suit. He set down the document and pulled out another. While you were telling the press your office was independently reviewing the case, phone records show you were personally calling the donor to solicit that specific check. You weren't just a passive recipient. You were the active solicitor of a donation from a man your office was supposed to be investigating for fraud. Vance pulled out a chart, holding it up for the cameras with a grim sense of finality. I had my staff analyze the timeline of your office's prosecutorial discretion over 8 years. We found over 40 instances where major corporate defendants or their lead lobbyists made significant contributions to your political committees within weeks of your office deciding to settle for pennies on the dollar or drop investigations entirely. The average settlement in these cases was 70% lower than what other states achieved for the same violations. He let that number hang in the air like a heavy fog. Madam General, regular prosecutors would be disbarred for this kind of coincidence. The best legal minds in the country consider your office's discretion to be a national punchline. You didn't run a Department of Justice. You ran a pay-to-play clearinghouse where the law was for sale to the highest bidder. That is not tough on crime, Madam General. It is legalized corruption with a Florida tan. Bondi's face had gone from camera ready to a mask of sheer defensive fury. The rules of campaign finance are very clear, she snapped. The rules were written by people like you to ensure that people like you never face a day in court. Vance said flatly, you disclose the money after the favor is already done. By the time the public sees the check, the victims have already been abandoned. You literally operated an office with a for sale sign on the front door, provided the buyer had a thick enough checkbook. He pulled out a comparison chart for the audience. Let us put this in perspective for the families watching at home. If a regular Florida citizen steals a $50 pair of shoes from a department store, you brag about your zero-tolerance policy and put them in jail. But if a billionaire donor defrauds Florida students of millions of dollars, you take a $25,000 check and call it a lack of evidence. Vance leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed louder than a shout. So, let me ask again, Madam General. Was the law blind when you took that money? Or was it just busy looking for the next donor? Either you are the most coincidental prosecutor in American history, or you turned the Attorney General's office into a private law firm for your donors. Which is it? Bondi tried to pivot, trying to talk about her record of fighting human trafficking, or protecting seniors. Vance just smiled and reached for the next folder in his pregnant portfolio. We will get to your human trafficking record when we discuss the special treatment given to certain massage parlor owners in Palm Beach, he said pleasantly. But first, let us talk about your role in the 2020 election challenges and the legal advice you were giving while simultaneously eyeing a position in the federal government. And folks, Vance was just getting started. That leather portfolio had 7 more bombs ready to detonate. The moderator was sweating now. This was no longer a news segment. It was a forensic autopsy of a political career. The ice cream and the designer scarves were gone. There was only the cold, hard weight of the receipts. Bondi attempted to regain her footing with the practiced, icy composure of a courtroom veteran, immediately falling back on the standard defense that political fundraising and prosecutorial decisions exist in 2 entirely different universes. Vance met this evasion not with a loud challenge, but with a slow, deliberate nod of his head, his hands already diving back into the leather portfolio to extract a new stack of documents marked with bright red tabs. He moved to systematically dismantle the idea of independence by highlighting a series of remarkably synchronized events that defined her tenure. He pulled the first set of documented financial records and case filings. January 2014. The evidence showed that your office received a series of complaints regarding a massive herbal supplement company accused of deceptive marketing practices that targeted the elderly. Just 2 weeks after your investigators recommended a full-scale probe, a political committee associated with your re-election received a total of $100,000 from the company's founder and its lead lobbyists. Within 10 days, the investigation was reclassified as a voluntary compliance review. And no fines were ever levied. Vance set that document down and immediately produced another. June 2015. A major national mortgage servicer was facing a massive multi-state settlement for robo-signing and illegal foreclosure practices that had forced thousands of Florida families out of their homes. Every other major state attorney general was pushing for significant restitution. However, after a series of private meetings with the company's executives and a subsequent $50,000 donation to your political fund, Florida became the first state to break ranks and sign a sweetheart deal that protected the company from further state litigation. The families in your state received pennies on the dollar compared to those in New York or California. The pattern became even more undeniable with the third exhibit, October 2016. A prominent travel industry giant was under fire for hidden fees and consumer rights violations. In the exact same month that your office was supposed to be finalizing a punitive consent decree, the company hosted a lavish fundraiser for your political allies. Magically, the punitive aspects of the decree were stripped away, leaving only a vague promise to improve communication. The company's stock price remained untouched, and your campaign war chest continued to swell. Vance then produced a consolidated, forensic analysis chart, holding it up so the high-definition cameras could capture the sheer scale of the correlation. This comprehensive study tracked your office's major settlements over an 8-year period, a total of 64 high-stakes corporate cases. In 64 separate instances, your office either dropped an investigation or signed an exceptionally lenient settlement within 30 days of receiving a significant campaign contribution from the defendant or their representatives. The average financial penalty you extracted was 69% lower than the national average for the exact same corporate violations. He let that staggering statistic hang in the air, the silence in the studio becoming heavy and uncomfortable. Professional prosecutors in any other jurisdiction would be under a grand jury investigation for this kind of timing. Vance observed with a thin, sharp smile. The most successful trial lawyers in the world might win half their cases. But your donors seem to have a 100% success rate in convincing your office to look the other way. This is not prosecutorial discretion. Madam General, this is not even a coincidence. It is a documented, high-speed toll road where the law only applies to those who haven't paid the entry fee. Bondi's face was no longer a mask of professional calm. It had shifted into a state of visible, defensive agitation. She quickly interjected, citing the Florida Sunshine Laws and claiming that every single donation was transparently disclosed and legally sound. Transparency about the price of a favor does not make the favor ethical. Vance countered flatly, his voice echoing in the quiet studio. Disclosing a check after you've already killed a fraud case is just providing the public with a receipt for the transaction. You and your legislative allies ensured that the ethics laws in Florida had loopholes wide enough to sail a corporate yacht through, which your donors did. Repeatedly, to the tune of millions of dollars. He presented a final, devastating comparison for the viewers at home. A typical Florida teacher or police officer, earning $50,000 per year for 37 years, would earn a total career income of $1.85 million. Pre-tax, one of your corporate donors saved more than that entire lifetime earning in a single afternoon because your office decided to settle a multi-million-dollar fraud case for a few $1,000s in administrative costs. The original question was reissued, now sharpened into a legal spear. The $25,000 check from the University Foundation, delivered days before you killed the fraud investigation, remains the smoking gun. Are the citizens of Florida supposed to believe you are the most coincidental prosecutor in the history of the Republic? Or did that check buy the silence of the Attorney General's office? Which is the truth? Her response was a desperate, final retreat into bureaucracy. My senior staff made the final recommendations on those cases based on the available evidence at the time. Did your senior staff also have access to your fundraising spreadsheets? Vance inquired, his eyebrows arching in theatrical disbelief. Because they managed to align their legal recommendations with your donor list on 64 distinct occasions. Madam General, that level of synchronization is not legal strategy. It is a retail operation. You didn't run a law enforcement agency, you ran a boutique legal service for the donor class. He cited an external study from a leading nonpartisan ethics watchdog which concluded that Florida's Attorney General's office had the lowest prosecution-to-complaint ratio in the country during her tenure. Your office was where consumer complaints went to die, and corporate donations went to grow. The evidence is clear. You utilized the immense power of your office as a bargaining chip for political gain. I am not persuaded by the merits of the case theory. Bondi attempted to pivot again, trying to talk about the opioid litigation and her role in suing the drug manufacturers. Vance just smiled, his hand already turning the page to a folder filled with documents about the pharmaceutical lobbyists she had called friends. We will certainly discuss the opioid crisis and why your office waited years to file suit while the bodies piled up in Florida. He said pleasantly, but first, let us move to your role in the events of the 2020 election and the selective application of legal integrity when power was on the line. The moderator, visibly struggling to maintain a neutral expression as the air in the studio grew thin with tension, attempted to steer the conversation toward a broader discussion of national security and the events surrounding the 2020 election transition. That is an excellent suggestion, Vance remarked, his voice sharpening. Let us examine the role of a top legal officer during a crisis, specifically the responsibility to uphold the law when it is most inconvenient for one's political allies. He turned his focus back to Bondi, reminding her of her prominent role as a high-profile surrogate and legal advisor during the post-election period. He bypassed her attempts to frame her involvement as mere legal advocacy, pointing instead to the direct influence she exerted over the narrative of election integrity. He dismissed the idea that she was just another lawyer in the room. The structure of her influence was clear. She was the public face of the legal challenges. A former attorney general whose words carried the weight of her previous office. This was not just legal work. Madam General, Vance noted, this was the strategic use of your former title to provide a veneer of legitimacy to claims that had no basis in fact. He then introduced a series of documents that established a disturbing timeline of her activities. November 2020, while election officials across the country, including those in Florida, were certifying results as secure and accurate, you were in Pennsylvania, standing on a podium, claiming the process was corrupt and illegal. You possessed no evidence that could stand up in a court of law, indeed. Your team lost over 60 lawsuits for that very reason. Yet you continued to broadcast these claims to millions of people. Vance produced the relevant court transcripts, quoting judges who had dismissed her team's filings as baseless and devoid of factual support. while you were appearing on cable news as a legal expert. The actual courts were laughing your cases out of the room. But the damage wasn't being done in the courtroom, it was being done in the minds of the public. The next document detailed the intelligence warnings and the escalating rhetoric in the days leading up to January 6, 2021. Specific threats of violence and plans for a breach of the Capitol were being flagged by law enforcement agencies. Vance pointed out that as someone with deep connections to the security apparatus and the highest levels of the administration, she was in a unique position to see the warning signs. Yet, the evidence showed that instead of calling for calm or reinforcing the importance of the peaceful transfer of power, she continued to stoke the fires of election fraud. Vance then transitioned the narrative to the subsequent investigation into those events. He highlighted how Bondi, through her media influence and political connections, became a key architect in the effort to deflect accountability. She had publicly criticized investigations into the security failures, labeling them as partisan witch hunts, while simultaneously ignoring the documented reality that her own allies had ignored repeated requests for enhanced security at the Capitol. The scope of her deflection was revealed through a comparison of her public statements. She had meticulously attacked the motives of the investigators, the background of the witnesses, and the integrity of the process. But the list of things she never discussed, the denied requests for National Guard support, the ignored FBI warnings, and the collapse of the security perimeter, was the clearest indicator of her true purpose. A former Attorney General, someone who knows the importance of an impartial investigation, became the primary shield for those who failed to protect the seat of government. Bondi attempted to argue that her role was to ensure every legal vote was counted, and that the investigations were politically motivated. Is that what you were doing? Vance immediately countered, producing internal memos from the legal teams she had advised. These documents showed that the legal strategy was never about winning in court. It was about creating a cloud of doubt to justify political interference. He then introduced an external report from a nonpartisan judicial ethics board. This report explicitly concluded that the legal challenges she helped lead were frivolous and detrimental to the public's faith in the judicial system. While the nation was facing a crisis of confidence, you were utilizing your prestige to deepen the divide. You controlled the narrative for your base by intentionally ignoring the findings of the courts. You weren't searching for the truth, you were protecting a political brand. The subsequent defense was not a search for justice. Vance concluded, it was a highly coordinated effort to obscure the truth, which you directed with the skill of a veteran media strategist. You chose the talking points. You ignored the evidence that contradicted your goals. And you made absolutely certain that the accountability never reached your inner circle. The failure was not just a legal one, it was a moral one. The highest legal officer was warned by the results of 60 lost cases. Yet she chose to continue the charade, only to later label the search for answers as a partisan attack. The moderator, now visibly struggling to maintain the pace of Vance's relentless prosecution, attempted to shift the dialogue toward the post-government career of a high-ranking official, specifically the transition into private practice and consulting. Vance accepted the pivot with a cold, predatory smile. A perfect topic, he remarked. Let us examine the revolving door of Tallahassee and Washington. Beginning with the speaker's, or in this case, the general's, immaculate transition into the world of elite lobbying in January 2019. Bondi's jaw set into a rigid line, her eyes flashing with defensive fire. She had spent the last several years cultivating an image of a private citizen who merely advised on legal matters. She was about to find out that Vance had mapped every square inch of her new, lucrative territory. January 2019. Vance began, noting that within mere weeks of leaving the Attorney General's office, Bondi had joined one of the most powerful lobbying firms in the nation. While thousands of Florida small business owners, the very constituents she claimed to protect, were struggling with the complexities of state regulation and the rising costs of insurance, Bondi was moving into a world of unprecedented luxury. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was an influence architect. Vance produced a series of photographs and travel records. One image showed Bondi at a high-end resort, draped in designer labels that cost more than a Florida teacher's annual salary. while you were still publicly railing against coastal elites and Washington insiders. You were becoming the ultimate insider. You traded your state-issued badge for a corporate credit card with no limit. The evidence became more specific with a focus on the opioid crisis. For years, as Attorney General, Bondi had been criticized for her slow response to the fentanyl and oxycodone epidemic ravaging Florida. Families were losing children at a rate of 15 per day. Yet, within months of entering the private sector, she was representing companies and interests directly connected to the pharmaceutical supply chain. Vance held up a documented list of her new clients. Let us look at the merits of your career transition. You spent 8 years investigating these industries for the state, and then spent the next 4 years being paid by them to ensure the state never bothered them again. That is not public service, Madam General. That is a long-term audition for a high-paying corporate role. The narrative of aristocratic detachment deepened with a look at her lifestyle during the national lockdowns of 2020. While she publicly supported the strict enforcement of rules for the safety of the public, she was frequently seen at high-level political gatherings and exclusive retreats that bypassed the very restrictions ordinary Floridians were forced to follow. Vance produced a series of social media captures and flight manifests from a private jet company, while small businesses in Tampa and Orlando were being shuttered by executive order. You were flying to private clubs in the Hamptons and hosting maskless fundraisers for the political elite. You didn't just ignore the rules, you acted as if they were geographically beneath you. People were losing their livelihoods, and you were showing off your designer wardrobe at private parties. Vance summarized, his voice dripping with barely contained disdain. That is the hallmark of the new political aristocracy. You preach the rule of law to the masses while you enjoy the rule of the elite. It is the modern version of let them eat cake. But instead of cake, you offered them a press release about how much you care. He introduced financial data regarding the firm she joined. During her first year as a lobbyist, the firm's revenue from Florida-based interests increased by 40%. Why? Did the firms suddenly find your legal brilliance irresistible? Or were they simply buying the contact list and the influence you accumulated while on the public payroll? The pattern of elite exemption was relentless. Vance cited her involvement in a high-profile security contract for a foreign entity, a deal that bypassed standard transparency requirements. You utilized the prestige of your former office to secure a deal that would have been a scandal if a low-level official had attempted it. But for the Sunshine State's enforcer, it was just another day in the private sector. Bondi made a desperate attempt at self-defense, claiming that her private sector work was legal and ethical, and that she had always followed the lobbying disclosure rules. Following the rules you help weaken is not a badge of honor. Vance shot back immediately. You never once apologized to the families of the opioid victims who watched you go to work for the very industry that fueled their tragedy. You never apologized to the small business owners who faced fines while you attended gala events. You never apologized for the one set of rules for the powerful, another for the powerless philosophy that has defined your entire career. He gathered the documents, his eyes locked onto hers. This is not selfless leadership, Madam General. This is the ingrained entitlement of a political class that views public office as a stepping stone to private wealth. You lived the life of a corporate queen while your state's families were told to tighten their belts. That is not the record of a public servant, it is the ledger of a professional influence peddler. Vance's voice dropped to a low, somber frequency, imbued with the measured and threatening weight of a seasoned prosecutor. We must now turn our attention to a core issue of justice, the profound disparity in how your office administered punishment. And before any defensive objection is raised, let me be perfectly clear. This is not merely about administrative errors. This is about the essential American principle of equal justice under law. He presented a series of case files that had been meticulously cross-referenced. The evidence detailed an incident in 2014 involving a major hospitality corporation with intimate ties to your largest campaign donors. This corporation had been accused of systemic safety and labor violations that resulted in documented injuries to numerous employees. However, instead of a rigorous criminal investigation or the imposition of heavy punitive fines, the Florida Attorney General's office at that time signed off on a quiet, Private settlement. Vance emphasized the brutal contrast. Under the explicit statutes of Florida law, systematic violations leading to bodily harm should have faced the most rigorous prosecution. Regular Florida citizens, the working men and women without a political voice, are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law when they violate even a minor safety regulation. You made examples of them. They faced jail time, fines that bankrupted their families, and a permanent, life-altering criminal record. The subsequent court documents were introduced, revealing the blatant preferential treatment afforded to those within the inner circle. Vance cited the case of a prominent campaign finance manager for your political allies, who was arrested for driving while intoxicated and causing a serious collision in 2016. Instead of being prosecuted for a felony, as prescribed by Florida law for a DUI involving injury, this individual was granted a miraculous reduction to a simple misdemeanor. His team of elite, high-priced attorneys successfully negotiated a sentence of only 5 days of community service and 3 years of probation. Vance then produced comparative case files, highlighting the harsh reality for ordinary citizens who lack political connections. John Martinez, Miami, 2016. Identical charge of DUI with an accident, with a blood alcohol content nearly identical to your associate's. His sentence: 18 months in county jail, 3 years of probation, massive financial penalties, and the immediate termination of his employment. Maria Gonzalez, Orlando, 2015. A similar violation with minor injuries. Her sentence: 1 year in jail, 5 years of probation, and the permanent revocation of her nursing license, effectively ending her professional life. Your political associate causes an accident while intoxicated and receives 5 days of community service. John Martinez receives 18 months in prison. Maria Gonzalez loses her entire career. What is the observable difference here? Madam General? Is it the thickness of the campaign contribution ledger that determined the severity of the law? Bondi initiated the predictable political defense. The judicial system independently made its determination based on mitigating circumstances. The judicial system provided your friends with a blatant, curated favor. Vance countered immediately. The facts pointed to a specific pattern. The prosecutors handling these sensitive cases were often your personal appointees or individuals with deep-seated political ties to your office. Your friends purchased the finest legal defense money could buy, while ordinary people were crushed by the gears of a law you claimed was impartial. The final exhibit demonstrated a profound moral inconsistency. Vance recalled how Bondi had personally demanded maximum prosecution and the harshest possible penalties for political opponents or protesters who had committed minor administrative infractions. I am not suggesting that lawbreakers should go unpunished. I am asking, why do your political family and friends receive the maximum leniency for genuine crimes, while you demand the most ruthless punishment for those on the opposite side of the political aisle? Your associates received what amounted to a private pardon for a DUI with injury. Yet, you personally demanded that individuals who opposed you face the full, unsparing force of the law for far lesser acts. That is not equal justice. That is a documented two-tier justice system. Everyone paid their debt to society according to the rules. Bondi protested weakly. Your friends paid a tiny fraction of the debt that ordinary citizens are forced to pay. Vance corrected forcefully. 5 days of community service compared to 18 months of hard time for John Martinez. A minor infraction compared to the loss of a professional license for Maria Gonzalez. Your political family, Madam General, enjoys justice à la carte. Leniency for the favored, and severity for the rest. That is not equality under law. That is the aristocracy operating as if the law is a suggestion for them and a cage for everyone else. He gathered the documents related to the incidents. This is the consistent, undeniable pattern across your entire career. The crimes of major donors are overlooked. The scandals of close associates are quietly settled. Meanwhile, you demand the highest standards of accountability from anyone who dares to oppose you. It is the core tenet of your tenure: rules for thee, but not for Pam Bondi. Vance shifted the focus to the most profound and serious legal actions of Bondi's career. Her aggressive participation in the unprecedented litigation surrounding the 2020 election and the subsequent impeachment defenses. Bondi, clearly believing she was returning to a subject where she could showcase her loyalty and constitutional expertise, straightened her posture. She asserted that her actions were always aimed at protecting the sanctity of the vote. Vance immediately produced the first set of legal filings, dating from November 2020. The documents were the official challenges she had helped spearhead in Pennsylvania and other swing states. Madam General, you traveled across the country using your title as a former Attorney General to lend a veneer of official credibility to claims that had no evidentiary basis. Vance stated firmly, "The founders designed our legal system to rely on facts and evidence. You, however, traded in hearsay and political theater. The entire foundation for those legal challenges," he reminded her, centered on allegations of systemic fraud. Yet, as the cases moved through the courts, the reality was starkly different. Vance produced the relevant court transcripts, quoting judges, many of them appointed by her own party, who had dismissed the filings with scathing language. While you were appearing on national television claiming the election was illegal, the actual courts of this land were recording a record of 61 losses and 0 wins. You weren't practicing law, Madam General. You were practicing propaganda. More documents followed, detailing the specific, legal advice she provided during the attempt to overturn the results. Vance highlighted internal memos where the strategy was explicitly described not as a path to a legal victory, but as a method to create a cloud of doubt that would justify legislative interference. This was not constitutional oversight. This was the weaponization of the legal process to subvert the democratic will. You utilized the highest tools of the law to attack the very foundation of the republic. The examination moved to her role in the defense during the impeachment proceedings. Vance produced the transcripts where Bondi had argued that investigating a president's use of foreign aid to influence an election was an abuse of the impeachment process. You argued that abuse of power was a partisan invention. Vance noted with a sharp, ironic smile. Yet, you spent 8 years in Florida using the abuse of power narrative to target every minor local official who happened to belong to the opposite party. You redefined the Constitution daily to fit the needs of your political benefactors. The speed and aggression of her partisan litigation were presented as the final proof of motive. Vance pointed to the filing of a massive multi-state lawsuit at the Supreme Court that sought to invalidate millions of votes in other states. You claimed to be a federalist who respected state sovereignty. Yet, you joined a legal action that asked the federal government to reach into other states and throw out their ballots because you didn't like the outcome. That is not constitutional consistency, that is constitutional convenience. Vance spread the collection of dismissed lawsuits and failed appeals on the table. You have permanently cheapened the office of the Attorney General by turning it into a partisan law firm. Vance concluded with finality. The law is supposed to be a shield for the people. You used it as a sword for your allies and a cloak for their failures. Every future legal officer who treats their position like a campaign office will look to your record as the blueprint. He produced one last, decisive document, a transcript from a private donor meeting in late 2020. Where Bondi was recorded saying that the goal of the litigation was to keep the base energized, regardless of the legal outcome. You were searching for a way to maintain power, not a way to find the truth. This was never about the Constitution, it was about the continuation of a political dynasty. You decided on the narrative first, and then relentlessly manipulated the legal system to support it. That is not defending democracy, Madam General. That is the blatant weaponization of the law. We were simply ensuring that every legal vote was counted. Bondi attempted to interject, her voice rising in pitch. You were ensuring that the public's trust in the law was burned to the ground for the sake of a political brand. Vance countered, democracy requires accepting the law even when the law tells you, no. You were told, no, 61 times by 61 different courts. Yet you continued to use your prestige to claim the system was broken. You didn't defend the law, you assaulted it. Vance pulled forward a new folder, visibly thicker than the others, containing documents marked with sensitive security classifications and financial forensics that had been recently finalized. The final subject was the general's transition from the highest law enforcement officer in Florida to one of the most well-paid influence peddlers in the nation's capital. I refer not merely to your professional career path, Madam General, Vance began, but to the documented, lucrative bridge you built between your official duties and your private bank account. Bondi's face, which had maintained a rigid defiance through the previous 6 rounds, finally betrayed a deep, visceral anxiety. This was the specific territory she had labored for years to sanitize through polished press releases and non-disclosure agreements. The general was reminded of her final months in office and the immediate aftermath of her tenure. Commercial expertise is one thing, Vance conceded, but the nature and timing of your transition into the lobbying world suggest that your final years in public service were effectively a multi-million-dollar audition for your future corporate masters. Business records were presented. Vance detailed her immediate hiring by a powerful global lobbying firm in January 2019. Within months, she was representing foreign entities and major corporate interests that had previously had business before her office. The clients didn't hire you for your knowledge of the law, Madam General. It was documented. They hired you for your ability to bypass the law. They paid for the phone numbers of the people you had just spent 8 years working with. Campaign finance and lobbying disclosures followed, demonstrating the policy correlation. Year 2019. Your firm's revenue from Florida-based interests spiked by 40%. Year 2020. You represented a massive technology conglomerate that was facing a multi-state antitrust investigation, an investigation your former office had conspicuously declined to lead. Year 2021. You were lobbying for special interests seeking state-funded incentives that you had helped authorize during your final legislative session. Financial forensics confirmed that Bondi's personal net worth had expanded exponentially since she traded her public badge for a lobbyist's badge. And consistently, your private advocacy mirrored the very areas where you had previously exercised prosecutorial discretion. You spent 8 years being soft on certain industries, and they rewarded you with a hard contract the moment you stepped out of the Attorney General's suite. You repeatedly posture as a champion of law and order. Vance challenge. You appear on cable news as a moral authority on justice. Yet, when you entered the private sector, you became the primary advocate for a foreign government that has been accused of systemic human rights violations and the suppression of democratic dissent. Where was your unwavering commitment to justice when the retainer check arrived from a foreign autocracy? Lobbying is a constitutionally protected activity involving complex international relations. Bondi weakly attempted to justify. Lobbying, in your case, is the monetized betrayal of the public trust. Vance stated with unvarnished bluntness. You spent 8 years collecting a taxpayer salary to enforce the law. And now you collect millions to help the wealthy evade it. That is not a career transition, Madam General. That is an undeniable conflict of interest. The timeline was established again, the dropped investigations, the sweetheart settlements, the timely donations, and the immediate, high-paying lobbying contracts. Other public servants leave office and return to their communities. You left office and returned to the donors. You put your future portfolio ahead of the present interests of Florida's citizens. Vance pivoted abruptly to the state of the justice system in her wake. Pulling out data on Florida's consumer protection record. You represented the people of Florida for 8 years. Let us now discuss what your long tenure actually delivered for the victims of fraud. The data was a shocking visual contrast to the general's professional success. Thousands of pending consumer complaints that were administratively closed, without resolution. A documented surge in predatory lending and fraudulent medical practices that thrived during her final term. Statistics followed. Under her tenure, Florida had one of the lowest restitution-to-loss ratios for victims of corporate fraud in the nation. Retirees in St. Petersburg and veterans in Pensacola were left to fend for themselves while you were hosting fundraisers with the very executives who oversaw the schemes. You achieved a 99% success rate for your donors, but a near-zero success rate for the thousands of Floridians who were defrauded on your watch. The office operated with limited resources under complex legal constraints. Bondi interjected defensively. The office operated with a "for sale" sign on the door. Vance countered. You had the power. the budget, and the constitutional mandate to protect those people. Instead, you utilized that power to build a bridge to a lucrative private life. What was the result? Lobbying records showed that during her first 3 years in the private sector, she facilitated access for clients who had collectively saved hundreds of millions of dollars in potential fines because of settlements she had authorized. You didn't just leave the office, you took the office with you and sold it by the hour. That is not public service. That is the ultimate betrayal of the oath you swore. Vance spread out the total accumulation of evidence. 8 years of absolute legal authority. And this is your definitive legacy: thousands of victims left without justice. A justice system that favors the donor over the citizen. And a personal fortune built on the revolving door between government and industry. While you move between your multiple luxury properties, the people you were supposed to protect are still trying to recover their life savings. You were the highest legal officer in the state, Vance stated finally, and you utilized that power not to uphold the law, but to curate a network that would personally enrich you the moment you stepped down. This is not success. This is a moral bankruptcy that has left the people of Florida poorer and the law itself weaker. He held up the victims' affidavits again. This is your true record. The final round was a cold, hard summary of her political obsolescence. Madam General, you represent a political era that is coming to an end. An era where law and order was a slogan used to control the poor while the wealthy bought their way out of accountability. You spent your career being tough on those who had nothing, and discreet with those who had everything. I am a career professional who has always followed the law. Bondi protested, her voice wavering under the pressure. Following the letter of the law while violating its spirit is the definition of a careerist. Vance countered with cold, documented certainty. You knew how the system worked. And you worked it for yourself. You prioritized power, wealth, and influence over the very people who gave you their trust. Vance stood, gathering his leather portfolio for the final time. Madam General, you came here tonight seeking a legacy rehabilitation. History will record a far different verdict. You ignored the Trump University fraud because of a $25,000 check. You provided sweetheart deals to major corporations after receiving timely donations. You turned the Attorney General's office into a revolving door for pharmaceutical and corporate lobbyists. You weaponized the legal system for partisan gain after the 2020 election. And you utilized the prestige of your office to secure a multi-million-dollar private career representing the very interests you were supposed to regulate. You are not a champion of the law. Madam General, you are a warning about what happens when the scales of justice are used as a balancing act for a campaign ledger. Respectfully, your era is over. Go enjoy your lobbying contracts and your luxury retreats. Let a new generation of legal officers who aren't looking for their next corporate payday try to restore the trust you spent 8 years eroding. History will not remember you as a pioneer. It will remember you as the personification of pay-to-play politics. The studio was dead silent. Bondi attempted a rebuttal, but the words were hollow, drowned out by the documented weight of the receipts Vance had left on the table. For the first time in her career, the Sunshine State's enforcer had no defense. The evidence was absolute.